This week, John Strand and I interview Al Ghous. He's the Senior Director of Cybersecurity at GE Digital, where he's responsible for GE's digital cloud platform, including containers. So we're going to have an awesome conversation with Al. I'm very excited about that. After that, there are two segments that will air. Matt Alderman and myself sat down at Black Hat and DEF CON, and we're recapping all of the analyst and vendor briefing work that we did while we were out there. The two segments are going to air after this, the interview. The first one is on ICS security. So we did several briefings with different companies and talked about the space in general for ICS security. We did the same thing with attack simulation. Those will air as independent segments that Matt and I recorded at our pool cabanas at Black Hat and DEF CON. So if you're shopping in those two areas or just want to learn more about those spaces, you're going to have a great time listening to Matt and I in a very relaxed environment. And so stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
I'm a tiger. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly. I don't know how this is going to go because Paul's not here this week, but we're just going to give it a shot.
Even if you've got experience in security, you can benefit from going to somewhere and learning about that bug again. Wearing my tactical turtleneck just for Mr. John Strand, who is on the lines via Skype. John, welcome to the program.
I'm wearing the tactical fleece as well, Paul. This is
Excellent.
A fully, completely, and utterly tactical show.
Improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your security operations with DF Labs security orchestration, automation, and response technology. Automate threat containment, orchestrate incident response, and measure operational performance with DF Labs in-command SOAR platform. Leverage your current security resources to minimize incident resolution time, maximize analyst efficiency, increase the number of incidents handled, and reduce overall risk. In-command SOAR acts as a force multiplier, enabling your security team to do more with less. Streamline the full incident response lifecycle automation process today. Keep your cybersecurity incidents under control with DF Labs. Visit dflabs.com/Security Weekly and request to see in-command SOAR live in action. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live.
Welcome, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. It's good to be back here in studio after fresh off the heels of Black Hat and DEF CON, which of course happened in the hot desert sun. Out there with me was my other co-host for today, Mr. John Strand. John, welcome to the show on the lines via Skype.
I absolutely love your Scythe shirt from Grimm. That's such a cool shirt. The magical unicorn.
My good friend Christine. Shout outs to Christine. That works for Scythe now. It gifted me this shirt. It is, and I do have to say, I'll give you even more props. It's the only shirt I took back from the show, from like the vendor area, because I have way too many T-shirts. But she said this was limited edition, and it was so cool, and she was so excited to give it to me that I decided to wear it on the show.
The other shirt that I brought back, I have that one, and then there's another one that has Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction on in front of it, and it says, "Say GDPR one more time."
I love it.
It's like, that's a great shirt.
Yeah, you have to make a couple of exceptions. So we've got a great webcast coming up with Endgame tomorrow from 3 to 4. Make sure you go to securityweekly.com/endgame. If you're hearing this after tomorrow, because today is August 15th, right? 2018. You can still go to that website, and there will be information about how you can get that webcast. Fishing, there's a sucker born every minute. Matt Alderman and myself will talk about the state of fishing technologies, techniques that are working for both defense and a little bit about offense as well. I think this one will probably be more defensive focused, given that Matt and I will be on it. Next one, if we have John or someone from John's team on it, could be more offensive, if you will. But this one will be more defensive. And Endgame is going to make a very special announcement, which is some technology that I have been privy to for some time, which I'm really excited about. So make sure you check that out, securityweekly.com/endgame. Again, if you missed it, make sure you go back to that page and you can consume that content. And it's worth it, really. I mean, for Matt and I to talk about what we're going to talk about, but also for Endgame's announcement, which is really, really cool. Okay. So we are ready. John, did you have anything else? Sorry. Look, you're about to say something, or you were yawning, one of the two. Or no, you're muted. That's what it is. That's why.
Yeah, I was yawning. It's not that you're boring. It's just I haven't slept much.
Oh no, I hear you.
Coming home from DEF CON has not been good to me.
Yeah, so. I came home and got the con flu. I lost my voice Monday and Tuesday, and then I got the con flu on Monday when I get back too. So that's not been fun. But it's good to be back in the saddle, and I'm very excited for Al Ghous to join us today. Al, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Paul. Guys, appreciate it. Good to be here with you guys.
Yes. Al, so not only do I think you're a really nice person, I'm also excited to talk about containers and container security because I think it's such an exciting area of our field. You know, we mentioned attack simulation,
yep.
And we were talking about containers. These are very new areas, both of development and security, as it applies to both. So, Al, give us. It depends. It's up to you where you want to start. Kind of on your journey, Al, for container security. So why don't you lead us off?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'll give a little backdrop just so we have some context here. So G Digital, most may know, we're at the intersection of IIoT and cloud, right? Mm-hmm. So we have a platform that we've built called Predix.io. And it's all about our industrial customers and the data and the assets that they have and how they can use our platform and the microservices and the applications and the micro applications on top of those to receive and obtain better insights as to their data and be able to manage their assets more effectively and things like that. So we've been public knowledge. We've been using CloudFoundry for some time, still do. But also at the same time we are making a very hard push towards containerization and providing containers as a service, for our various services internally to house our applications and other microservices. So this started, a while ago. We went through some iterations, looking at different technologies, both from a container perspective and also orchestration perspective. And today we have a nice solid service that we build around containers, and that's what we use to basically implement and deploy our applications for our industrial customers. And so with that said, this is still, somewhat of a new area for everybody. And I can vouch for that by saying, look, I've been posting in certain, blogs and various private Slack channels and websites around cybersecurity space. And typically I interact with executives at the C-level, CIOs, CEOs, CSOs, CISOs, head of security here and there. And, when I post questions around, hey, who's embarking on container security and, how are you guys managing Mesos or Kubernetes? From a security perspective, I get nothing in response. I hear crickets. So that tells me that, we're still kind of at the early stages of trying to figure containerization out. A lot of organizations have deployed containerization, but security, cybersecurity, info security hasn't really caught up. So I'm hoping that in this session we can kind of walk through a little bit about our journey. And it's not purely focused on just technology. It's around everything else also that makes up that container ecosystem, containerization ecosystem, from infrastructure all the way up to VM and network.
Al, from the business side, before we get into the security side, what were some of the benefits of containers? And the reason I ask that is I want our security audience to understand why this technology is being adopted.
Right. Well, I mean, containers are really nothing more than, OS level virtualization. So if you look at, when we had bare metal and servers, client server architecture, and then virtualization, came onto the scene. We had the same challenges, right? But yet, there's very compelling business reasons to go, to virtualize, and then cloud came after that, right? So again, it's economies of scale, it's scalability, resiliency, performance, operations, and top of all of that is cost, right? Reducing cost. And for us, being in the cloud space as a platform provider, as a SaaS and PaaS provider, we have to be able to reduce costs in terms of scale. So there's a cost per workload that we have, and we needed to decrease that cost. So at the end of the day, the speed at which we can provide a platform for the application teams and the product service lines, the quicker we could do that, the quicker they can get their applications out there, easier, faster, cheaper. That's really all. That's really what it's about. And again, it started with virtualization. Now we're looking at containerization, and to go back full circle. And the security challenges are the same, and we'll talk a little bit about that.
Go ahead, John.
So when you talk about the security challenges, what are the common mistakes that you see organizations make? Because there's a lot of organizations that are getting ready to move into this containerization space, and I'm sure people would love to hear what are the common pitfalls that you see organizations make.
Yeah. So before I answer that, let me just talk a little bit about containers in general. Some of the pros and cons from a security perspective, and then we get into here's some of the pitfalls, right? Not just from a cybersecurity perspective, but from an organizational perspective. At the end of the day, containers are, like I said, they're nothing really more than OS level virtualization. So their attack surface becomes smaller than traditional, virtual machines and bare metal and servers, right? They also have a shorter lifespan. They're easier to deploy and redeploy. So the time that it takes for somebody to be able to penetrate and exploit a vulnerability or defect,
Al,
that's decreased.
Al, I read that once somewhere, and I forget where, but I regurgitate that and I make everyone repeat it, like in my presentations about container security. Containers are immutable, and for us, for a lot of sysadmins out there, that's difficult to wrap your brain around.
Right. And at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because when you really look at it, it's a new technology. The shorter lifespan also has security implications because if it's gone, there's really nothing to investigate. So if you're trying to figure out what the heck happened and one of your containers got popped and then it's gone, because they're all ephemeral, right? And and so that's a drawback also. But going back to the original question, I think from a security perspective, it's hard for us to be able to gain visibility into the DevOps pipeline where containers are being built and deployed. So again, this is nothing new for us, right? We've been through this before when it comes to application security and deploying infrastructure using pipelines, DevOps. Visibility is a big thing for us. The other thing is, if you do have access and you do have visibility into the pipeline, really try and integrate your tools, whether they're open source, commercial, marketplace tools into the pipeline. You introduce a lot of friction, right? We talk about trying to reduce friction as much as possible when you're deploying security technologies. A lot of us have challenges still around that. The next thing is really around just having access and visibility into the intra-container communication, right? When you talk about Kubernetes and Docker and things like that, there's a lot of intra-container communication that we typically don't have visibility into. And then what are those containers doing? How do they behave? What's normal? What's abnormal, right? Can you distinguish between goodness and badness? So those things become critical for us as well. Again, these are nothing new. We've been through this before. It's just another layer of abstraction. Right. So those are some of the common challenges that we faced when we started working with our DevOps and our platform and infrastructure teams. And there's things that we did to overcome that. We went through some tough patches at times, but at the end of the day, we were in a good place. So hopefully that answers that question.
And Al, what's the role of the orchestrator And how does that play into, like, at a high level, in operations? And then what are some of the security challenges with the orchestrator, such as Kubernetes?
Right. So Kubernetes, that's just one, right? There's several out there. It's really to help with the deployment, maintenance, scaling of applications, because that's really critical when it comes to containerization and to our application teams. They really they abstract the underlying implementation and they take it away from the developer and the end user, right? And it just dramatically simplifies things for them so that they deploy their applications a lot faster, quicker. And on top of that, for product companies such as us, go to market, right? So it really helps with the removing the manual process of deployment, and helps if you look at, for example, a traditional application development pipeline. Kubernetes is pretty much the same thing, but to the container world. And so again, it's all about speed, frictionless, a way to be able to deploy containers in a timely fashion, and at the same time to also deprovision containers as well, because they come and go, highly ephemeral.
Yeah, so it's interesting. One aspect is it lets a developer build their own environments and build new environments, but the details of that container and how it's built lives in the orchestrator. So an ops person or security person can say, no, like when we deploy these kind of containers, it has to have these elements or not have these elements. Yeah.
Right. A big piece of that is, if anybody's worked with Docker, it's the, trusted registry, right?
Yeah.
Where your pristine gold images reside, and that's what you trust. And, something like Kubernetes will work with DTR to be able to, provision containers out of the registry, basically, and make sure that you have a clean image to deploy for a specific workload. So it takes a bit to get there.
Right.
But we went through some trials and tribulations at the end of the day. Sure. Again, this is all new stuff, right? Nobody was doing this, so we just had to learn it on the fly as we went.
John?
No, you actually asked the same question I was going to ask.
Okay.
So we're good.
No worries. We share a brain sometimes. It's awesome. So now there are a couple of, the way I understand it, there's like two major features that you're looking for security solutions in this space, Al. And that's, I want to scan my containers and make sure they contain all the right things or don't have any vulnerabilities or exposing my data, right? So there's the scanning of the actual image or container. I'm probably mixing those terms. You can correct me. And then there's the actual monitoring and taking action within my container environment to say, I've observed something that's bad, let me do something about it. So can you talk about those two different solutions and kind of how you basically the requirements you developed for both those different security solutions?
Absolutely. Now, before I get into that, there are capabilities within container solutions, whether it's orchestration or containerization themselves, like Docker and Kubernetes. They have some capabilities that are security capabilities that are inherent with those products, and I highly encourage people to look at those. They've gotten a lot better over time. For example, Kubernetes. There's a lot of defaults that were implemented in the original, that were available to implement it with the original Kubernetes, some of the earlier versions, and they created a huge attack surface, for their orchestration platform. They've gotten a little bit better over time. Same thing with Docker, SecComp, right? It has the capabilities to be able to do some security, but shouldn't just rely on that. And I encourage everybody to start looking out there and putting a set of requirements together, not in a silo from a cybersecurity perspective. Work with your DevOps, your platform, your infrastructure, cloud infrastructure teams to make sure they're involved, because at the end of the day, again, you're going to probably throw another agent or some other mechanism into the mix that's going to impact the orchestration and the deployment of containers, and they want to keep it as frictionless as possible. So with that said, we basically went through a process of really looking at what are we trying to solve? Like, what's our problem? We talked about that a little bit earlier, right? It's about visibility or lack thereof. And then we came up with, okay, look, we need to be able to, harden the images, right? Originally, that's what you got to do. You got to be able to take your, Docker images or whatever you have and apply some baseline configuration to it. Again, nothing new. We've done this before for Windows, for Linux, all kinds of flavors of Linux, for different, third-party software. And CIS is a great resource for that, right? So Center for Internet Security. So we looked at that and we said, okay, we got to have benchmarks for Docker, and they have benchmarks for Kubernetes. So we really just use those. We've customized it to our environment, and we came up with a clean image, basically a number of images for our application teams to use. So that's the first step, is really just be able to conduct some scanning up front, right? This is all through the pipeline now. Make sure that you have a pipeline that you can start scanning, conducting static scanning of the image. Make sure that it's clean, pristine. You have a gold image in Docker Trusted Registry, so that you can start to orchestrate from there. The second thing is really around runtime analysis and detection, being able to monitor runtime activities, building behavior profile, activity profiles, as well as being able to detect, rogue software, other, third-party open source software that people throw in there for whatever reason, be able to detect those, and then really trying to figure out, how the container security technology gains visibility to the underlying kernel and the activities that go on within containers or intra-containers. A lot of them require, privilege access. And that was a non-starter for us. So that really shrank the pool of technologies out there really quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And I was with Matt Alderman actually, and when we were discussing, he was like telling the story to other people in container security and about those three different methods. And if your security solution requires that you're in a privileged container, or requires that it's in the kernel, it's very, very limiting to your deployment, correct, Al? And that's why you kind of threw those off the table.
Exactly. So what it does is it really opens up the attack surface, right? So for another technology to have again, root access. But what it also does is it creates a type of a man-in-the-middle attack, because everything must go through that. And then you start to introduce choke points, and then you impact performance. And then, DevOps teams and the infrastructure, our platform teams get, a notice of that, and then they come and start complaining, right? And that's where things get kind of messy and hairy. So we want to shy away from that.
They come to you and say, hey, we're going to test the deployment on Azure. And you're like, well, they don't allow for privileged containers. And then you're stuck.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot to consider before really going with any technology. Because it's so new, and you really can't, from a scalability perspective, really can't test. We can test, for example, performance and scalability to the extent that we wanted to. So we really I had to use my network. I had to use my peers in the industry, other CISOs and security folks that have either deployed one or more of those technologies, and I've gone through some pain points and come up with some best practices, as well as what worked for them versus what didn't work, so that we don't make those same mistakes. And I still do that to this day. I help our colleagues out there as much as I can.
So you talk about best practices, and one of the concerns that I have in this particular area of IT and in security is with containerization and all of these different things, it's accelerating very, very, very quickly. And then on top of that, we now have a collision of new classes of attacks, like the Spectre meltdown, speculative execution attacks, that then can leak memory or gain access to different memory regions outside of that particular part of virtualization for that container or even that operating system. What do you think what this intersection is this something that we're going to have to start dealing with? Because we had Spectre, we had Meltdown, and we just got an email a while ago about something called Foreshadow, which is another speculative execution attack. Are we now looking at, if you're going to be implementing containers, you have to literally start looking at that type of segmentation and that type of security approach to be able to deal with all of a sudden a 30% penalty on your CPU because of speculative execution attacks, and you need to plan accordingly for that type of attack coming against your containers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. Segmentation, micro-segmentation is huge for us. Again, we're in a multi-tenant cloud business, so and segmentation is not just at the container level. We do it at the virtualization level. We do it at the network level, application level, database, wherever it makes sense. It's one of those things where I think we're seeing a convergence, right? You mentioned those specific attacks and attack types and vulnerabilities and exploits. And with containers, it just exacerbates the situation a bit more. And then especially with kernel level access, that just makes things worse for us. So I totally agree. I think we're inflection point where things are just converging, and you really can't take a one-dimensional approach to whether it's container security or network security. You have to be able to take a look at upstream, downstream impact, and services and assets, and be able to map them together to make sure that from infrastructure on up. If something was to happen at the specific layer, what's the upstream and downstream impact? And containers has just made that a lot worse. So yeah, you got to be on top of your game this day and age.
Yeah, the scary part for me is all this technology is new, and when we talk about attacks, we're talking about speculative execution that's been in microcode for processors for years. And I also heard there was an attack on SSH. Did I read that somewhere? I mean, that's code. I mean, we've seen countless examples of code that's been around there for years. I think my concern with Docker and containerization and Kubernetes is that code is so new, and now we're relying upon it for all these awesome things because it's moving everyone along faster. Like, what's going to come out in these types of attacks?
Yeah, I'll tell you this much though. Look, at the end of the day, I think the research community is taking notice of all this, right? Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming, tons of CVEs come out for very well-known, container security or just containerization in general, container solutions, be it Mesos, Kubernetes, DCOS, Docker, whatever the case. There's researchers working on it right now, I bet, and CVEs are going to come out, and we're going to have to react, right? So it's one thing, I talked about, hardening the images and then runtime analysis and detection, but you also have to be able to proactively protect and monitor that environment. So ability to integrate with your SIEM, for example, whether you're using Sumo, Splunk, Elk, whatever the case is. You got to have visibility into the container world, and fork your logs to your SIEM so that you build your correlation rules and data models and whatever it is that you're building to be able to detect badness, basically. And then at the same time, be able to proactively protect and prevent, not just detect, but when you see something and it deviates from normal behavior, which hopefully you've built over time. Be able to prevent those from attacks from taking place. It's really easy to basically take any one of these infrastructure platforms offline. It's so easy to do. For example, denial of service, resource exhaustion when it comes to Kubernetes.
We definitely got bit by that. And I think that the current kind of attack status of this is very opportunistic, right? Like if you leave your Docker API exposed, like we did once over a weekend, someone's going to upload something to it. It's going to send out a DDoS. Now, the tools that are great for monitoring, like even if your infrastructure is compromised, like John's talking about some of the lower level, if you're attacking the kernel, if you're attacking the hypervisor, or even the processor, you need to have tools that are hooking your applications is kind of what Al's talking about. And like I always say there's the folks who are our sponsors are the ones I like for this technology, such as Signal Sciences, right, which is hooking my application. It doesn't matter where my application lives. They're looking at HTTP gets and responses, and as long as I can look at anomalies, then that's great. I know my application, or I have a better feeling that my application is protected. And then, of course, I like the technologies that like to hook the container itself. So I add one line to my build script in my orchestrator, and then every single container that's deployed can then talk amongst the platform. It's not like deploying an agent like we had before, or privileged containers or a kernel module. Those all have great limitations. The solutions that I really like today are the ones that just hook and are very easy to deploy.
Absolutely. And we call, and I'm sure this is a term out there, been thrown out there as well, low touch or zero touch. Yeah. That was the key for us also in our requirements gathering. And yeah, so that again, having all these requirements really narrowed the field for us quite a bit. And we solidified on Layered Insight because of those things that I mentioned and you just mentioned right now. The other thing with these companies, especially like, for example, Layered Insight, is they're so quick and nimble in that we had very unique requirements, and believe it or not, we were implementing a Docker and Docker. Don't ask them what the use case was, but that was something that we needed to be able to protect and have visibility and insights into. They're very quick in getting the capability out to us in their one of their subsequent releases. So working with technologies that listen to the customer, that understand, don't question, while you're doing something, and be able to, help them and, put features out there that again, facilitate the low touch, zero touch, frictionless approach. That was a huge benefit for us. And at the same time, be able to scale and not really introduce another attack vector or increase the attack surface. That's the last thing we wanted to do. So we use Layered Insight, but we also augment with other third-party open source solutions and things like that to be able to take advantage of what's best of breed out there, and not only secure the containers, but also the underlying orchestration platform and infrastructure around the whole ecosystem.
Al, whenever I see an organization such as yours that has a large container deployment, my question is always, how do you get over the tool fatigue, right? I mean, because you need a security solution, you need the container solution, you need an orchestrator, and then there's a lot of tools that are glomming on that for your CI processes. I'm sure you may have Jenkins in the mix, for example. How do you manage all that and make sure that it doesn't get out of control in terms of operations or security?
Yeah, well, you try to do your best to reduce your footprint. So, for example, you always challenge our if it makes sense, and there's commodity solutions or capabilities out there. For example, if I need to assess my my images and my Kubernetes infrastructure, there are open source scanners out there that I can use and be able to, run our CIS benchmark through it and conduct my scan and come up with an output. Now, if I have to select get another product to do that, whereas, my main product doesn't provide that, I will challenge them to say, look, why can't you just provide this as a value add to your customers? And you can charge or not charge. There are other technologies out there that do it, very effective and efficient for you guys to do it as well. You have the capability. So I challenge our vendors to do that. And by doing that, you reduce the number of tools. Now, granted, Jenkins does something different than Git, something different than, Layered Insight. You definitely don't want to, have one solution do everything for you, put all your eggs in one basket, right? We've been through that in the past. So it's really just trying to be very strategic about your technology selection and working with your DevOps teams to be able to select the right product so that they don't select something that either overlaps what you do or vice versa. I had that happen at the beginning where, we had some competing technologies in the space that serve different functions, but at the same time, there's a lot of overlap. And we quickly overcame that because, again, it was just open line of communication through our SDLC process. And in this case, S is not just software, it's also systems building and platform building as well. We go through one single process for everything. Right. And that facilitated, reducing the footprint of our tooling.
And hey, look, I think open source software is fantastic. I think it's great. However, I think you reach some of these decision points where if you're going to choose something open source and you think about they're going to add, change, or remove features based on maybe who has time, what they think is cool, and that's awesome, right? And a commercial product, there's typically a product manager that's recommending changes based on customer feedback. Now, if those are issues, you have to take that into consideration.
Absolutely.
You may be okay with open source software, and sure, that's fine if that decision tree doesn't affect you. But some of your solutions, you may need that guidance from an actual product manager that can make some of those decisions based on customer feedback. John?
And one of the things too, whenever you're looking at it, is if you're looking at the very large open source projects, like if you're looking at Linux or like Ubuntu as part of Linux or Apache, there are tremendous amounts of organizations funding that and supporting that. They have real development teams.
Yep.
But then once you get off those happy, shiny paths of those very, very large open source products, things get really messed up very quickly. You remember a couple of years ago with OpenSSL, we discovered that almost all of our SSL technologies are developed by a handful of developers that are completely overworked. They don't get any funding. And that scared the hell out of me. I mean, if you're looking at the very large products, you're probably going to be okay. But once you get away from like Apache and Linux, it can get very wily very quickly.
Yes, especially in the use space like containerization, right, or container security for that matter. Very critical. Yeah, you guys are right on. So it's a balancing act, right? I mean, that's what we're here, right? I mean, we have to figure out what makes sense. Again, and the good thing with us and Layered Insight is, we came to a really good agreement in terms of making sure that we keep our costs, manageable. Because again, we're not enterprise, not deploying, our HR applications on containers. We're product, and we have to be able to scale, not just from a technology perspective, but from a cost perspective, because we have POPs around the world, and we're going to grow. And so that was very important for us, and Layered Insight has been a great partner to help us manage that.
Fantastic. Any other suggestions, Al, for our audience that may be thinking about embarking on a container implementation, or security teams that have to support this?
I would say, a couple of takeaways, right? We talked about this a little bit. Talk to your DevOps team, include them early on, be in tune with what they're doing. For a lot of organizations that are doing containerization, I can almost guarantee that DevOps is way ahead of cybersecurity or information security. So you have to be able to sit down with them and educate them. It took us a long time to sit down and tell them what it means to have containers, what the security implications are. Not the first thing that when it comes to DevOps or PaaS or IaaS teams. So educating them, do whatever it takes. I had to bring our red team from Israel to conduct a 3-day training session for all of our engineering teams around Kubernetes, Docker, and whatnot. And we brought in our technology partner to help us with that. So it was really a win-win situation. They were able to see how just simple implementation of orchestration platform could be popped relatively very easily. And so that started to kind of make them think a little bit, and then that's when we said, okay, now we need to get involved a little bit more. It's really all about helping them and trying to deploy in a very safe fashion. So education, open lines of communications, and really being there to help them, and not so much introduce more friction and get in their way in terms of innovation and whatnot, but to really provide those guardrails for them so that they know. So they don't basically, tip over and fall off the rails. Mm-hmm. That's the biggest takeaway I can give our audience.
Fantastic, Al. It's great to hear from someone who's experienced this type of deployment. It's still, I think, a much smaller percentage than more traditional, such as enterprise Java applications, as one example. So it's nice to hear your stories and recommendations for our audience. I think it was extremely beneficial. So Al, with that, thank you very much for appearing on Enterprise Security Weekly. John, we're done for today's recording. We're done, because after this, Matt Alderman and myself are going to give you the entire rundown on 2 different categories in security. That's industrial control systems, or ICS security, and attack simulation. ICS is pretty serious, right? A lot of human life at risk there. Attack simulations are really fun and newer and emerging category. And Matt and I did briefings with people who founded companies in each of these spaces and share our thoughts and opinions on each of them. So I'm so excited. We've got more to come. I think we did 6 total. We did a cigar conversations and open source. So there's lots of content from Black Hat and DEF CON that'll be airing. And these 2 segments for Enterprise Security Week are awesome. I hope you enjoy them.
Fantastic.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks, John.
Thanks, everyone.
Good to be with you guys.